Picture this. It's 1806. Napoleon Bonaparte stands as the master of Europe. From the shores of Spain to the plains of Poland, his Grande Armée has crushed every opponent. Austria, Prussia, Russia, all have bent the knee. Only one nation remains defiant, a stubborn island kingdom protected by the world's most powerful navy, Great Britain. Napoleon knows he can't invade them. The Royal Navy is a fortress of oak and cannon he simply cannot breach. So he decides to fight a different kind of war, a war of economics, a war he believes will bring the nation of shopkeepers to its knees without a single French soldier landing on their shores. This is the story of the Continental System, Napoleon's grand gamble to economically strangle Britain. A plan so ambitious, so audacious, that it would not only fail spectacularly, but would also trigger the very downfall of its creator. This wasn't just a failed policy. It was a multi-billion-dollar mistake that redrew the map of Europe forever. So, what exactly was this Continental System? On November 21st, 1806, Napoleon issued the Berlin Decree. The language was absolute. It declared a complete blockade of the British Isles. All trade with Britain was forbidden. Any ship coming from a British port was to be seized. Any British goods found in French-controlled territory were to be confiscated. Napoleon's empire was vast, encompassing most of Western and Central Europe. By forcing his allies and conquered territories to join this blockade, he aimed to cut off Britain's most vital artery, its trade. Britain was the workshop of the world, a burgeoning industrial powerhouse. Its factories produced textiles, iron, and countless other goods that were sold across the continent. At the same time, it imported raw materials and food to sustain its population and its industries. Napoleon's logic was simple. If he could stop this two-way flow of goods, Britain's economy would collapse. Gold reserves would dwindle, credit would dry up, unemployment would soar, and social unrest would follow. The British government, facing a revolution at home, would have no choice but to sue for peace on Napoleon's terms. It was economic warfare on a scale never seen before. At first it seemed like the plan might actually work. The British economy did take a hit. Exports plummeted and certain industries faced a crisis. There were riots in some industrial towns as workers lost their jobs. But Britain was not a passive victim. In response, they issued their own set of decrees, the Orders in Council. These orders stated that any neutral ship trading with France or its allies would be seized by the Royal Navy unless it first stopped at a British port and paid transit duties. It was a brilliant counter-move. Britain was essentially saying to the rest of the world, you can trade with Napoleon, but you have to pay us first. With its naval supremacy, Britain could enforce this blockade far more effectively than Napoleon could enforce his. Suddenly, neutral nations like the United States were caught in the middle of an economic crossfire. This would eventually lead to the War of 1812 between the US and Britain, but that's a story for another day. The key point is, the seas were now a battleground, not just for warships, but for merchant vessels trying to navigate a web of conflicting decrees. The Continental System began to unravel almost as soon as it was created, and the reasons were fundamentally human. First, smuggling became a massive, continent-wide industry. From the rocky coasts of Spain to the harbors of the North Sea, illicit trade with Britain flourished. The demand for British goods, like coffee, sugar, textiles, and manufactured tools, was simply too high. People were willing to pay exorbitant prices for them. Even Napoleon's own officials were often corrupt, turning a blind eye to smugglers in exchange for bribes. In a classic twist of irony, the French army itself needed British-made goods. Napoleon's soldiers marched on British leather boots and wore greatcoats made from British cloth, all acquired through a complex network of smugglers and middlemen. The system was a leaky sieve from the very beginning. Napoleon was trying to defy the basic laws of supply and demand, and the market, as it always does, found a way. But the biggest problem wasn't the smuggling. It was the devastating impact the system had on the economies of Napoleon's own allies and subjects. While the goal was to hurt Britain, the blockade ended up hurting continental Europe far more. Port cities like Hamburg, Amsterdam, and Trieste, which had thrived on maritime trade for centuries, saw their economies collapse. Merchants went bankrupt, sailors were left jobless, and the general population suffered from shortages and soaring prices. Resentment against French domination grew with every passing day. People were being asked to endure severe economic hardship, not for their own benefit, but to serve Napoleon's obsession with defeating Britain. This bred a simmering anger that would soon boil over. The system was meant to unite the continent against Britain, but instead it was turning the continent against Napoleon. The cracks in the system turned into gaping fissures in two key regions, the Iberian Peninsula and Russia. In 1807, Portugal, a longtime trading partner of Britain, refused to comply with the Continental System. Napoleon's response was swift and brutal. He invaded. He sent his armies through Spain to conquer Portugal, and in the process, decided to depose the Spanish king and place his own brother Joseph on the Spanish throne. This sparked a massive, bloody uprising across Spain. The Spanish people, aided by a British expeditionary force under the Duke of Wellington, waged a brutal guerrilla war against the French occupiers. This conflict, known as the Peninsular War, became a Spanish ulcer for Napoleon. It drained his empire of hundreds of thousands of troops and vast sums of money, a constant bleed that he could never stop. All of this was a direct consequence of trying to enforce his economic blockade. The fatal blow, however, came from the east. Tsar Alexander I of Russia had initially agreed to the Continental System, but by 1810, the Russian economy was in shambles. The blockade had cut off a vital trading relationship with Britain, devastating Russia's landowners and merchants. Facing immense pressure at home, the Tsar quietly reopened trade with the British. For Napoleon, this was the ultimate betrayal. It was a direct challenge to his authority and the cornerstone of his entire strategy. His response would be the single greatest military disaster of the 19th century. In 1812, Napoleon assembled the Grande Armée, a force of over 600,000 men drawn from every corner of his empire, and launched an invasion of Russia. His goal was not necessarily to conquer Russia, but to force the Tsar back into the Continental System. We all know how that story ends. The brutal Russian winter, the scorched earth tactics of the Russian army, and the vast, unforgiving distances decimated Napoleon's forces. Of the more than 600,000 men who marched into Russia, fewer than 100,000 staggered back out. It was a catastrophe from which Napoleon would never recover. The myth of his invincibility was shattered. Seizing the opportunity, the nations of Europe, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden, rose up and joined Russia and Britain in a new coalition against him. The war that followed, the War of the Sixth Coalition, culminated in the Battle of Leipzig in 1813, also known as the Battle of the Nations, where Napoleon was decisively defeated. He was forced to abdicate and was exiled to the island of Elba. So let's connect the dots. The Continental System was created to defeat Britain. To enforce it, Napoleon had to invade Portugal, which led to the disastrous Peninsular War. To enforce it, he had to punish Russia, which led to the catastrophic invasion of 1812. The invasion of Russia destroyed his army and shattered his reputation, directly leading to the formation of the coalition that ultimately defeated him. It was a chain reaction of disaster, and the first link in that chain was the Berlin Decree of 1806. He traded a potential long-term economic victory for a short-term military overreach. In today's money, the cost of these wars, the lost trade, and the economic devastation across Europe would easily run into the hundreds of billions, perhaps even trillions of dollars. Napoleon, the brilliant military strategist, proved to be a disastrous economist. He failed to understand that economies are not like armies. They cannot be commanded and controlled by force alone. In trying to build a cage for the British lion, he ended up building his own prison. His grand blockade, designed to be his ultimate weapon, became the instrument of his own destruction. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this dive into history fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about the epic triumphs and disastrous mistakes that shaped our world. Let us know in the comments what other historical blunders you'd like to see us cover. See you in the next video.